Chapter 8. Karen jumped back as bullets cracked into the door. Chunks of rotten flesh splattered up from Ammon's body. The corpse danced and waved in a shuddering, jerking rhythm of macabre motion. David snatched at the coat of the dead man and yanked, but the door was pinned open by the clattering fire, and whoever was shooting was coming closer, the explosive shots louder, splinters of flesh and wood pelting them with greater force. They were trapped, both exits blocked. Rebecca clutched her Beretta in one shaking hand, watching for a signal from David. He pointed roughly northwest, into the compound, shouting to be heard over the whining, spitting clatter of the automatic fire.
"Rebecca! Other door! John! Karen! Next building secure! Steve, we cover! Go!"
As one, Steve and David leaped out and started to fire, the booming rounds punctuating the lighter hail of deadly ammo. John and Karen charged out at a full run, were instantly swallowed up by the shadows. Rebecca spun and trained her weapon on the back door, her heart pounding in her throat. The walls trembled and shook.
"Die, Jesus! Why won't they die?"
There was a strain of disbelief and terror in his voice that made her blood run cold.
"Zombies?"
Without looking away from the rectangle of dark wood, Rebecca shouted as loud as she could, her voice cracking over the relentless spray of the automatic.
"Headshots! Aim for the head!"
There was no way to know if they'd heard her. The rifle or rifles kept pounding, approaching. Her thoughts raced to understand, images of the T-virus victims flitting through her mind. They'd been mindless, slow, inhuman, and accidental, not on purpose, not with purpose.
"Rebecca, let's go!"
There was still the sound of an automatic rifle firing, but the boathouse no longer shook from the impact of its force. She shot a glance back, saw Steve still shooting at something, saw David motioning at her to move. She sidled for the open door, catching a sickening up-close look at the bullet-riddled corpse still hanging there. The head had caved in like a rotting pumpkin, teeth shattered, gummy flecks of tissue radiating out from behind the skull. The waving hand was no longer connected to the rotting arm, the radius and ulna blown away. It dangled there like some obscene decoration, beckoning. Steve fired once more and the auto's clatter ceased. He raised the weapon, his eyes wide and shocked as he opened his mouth to say something. But the back door crashed open, bullets flying through the dark in a blaze of orange fire. David pushed her roughly through the front and she ran, the responding crack of 9mm rounds resonating behind her.
"Get to the building! Get to cover!"
She sprinted through the shadows, her wet shoes thumping across packed, rocky dirt, the searching gaze finding the outline of a massive concrete block against the spindly trees that surrounded it in the darkness.
"Here!"
She veered towards the call, saw John's muscular form silhouetted by pale starlight at the corner of the building. As she neared him, she saw the open door, Karen standing in the entry with her weapon trained back towards the boathouse. Bullets still sang through the shadows.
"Get in!"
She stepped out of the way, and Rebecca ran past her, not slowing until she was inside. She fell into a table in the pitch black, cracking one hip painfully against the edge. Turning, she saw Karen firing, heard John yelling,
"Come on, come on!"
and Steve pounded through the door, gasping. He pulled to a stop before crashing into her, one hand clutching at his chest. Rebecca moved to the door and grasped the cool thickness, her mind absently registering the material was steel as David hurtled through, shouting,
"Karen! John!"
Karen backed into the darkness, weapon still raised. There were 3 more sharp reports from a Beretta, and then John slipped inside, his jaw clenched, his nostrils flaring. Rebecca slammed the door, her fingers finding a deadbolt switch. The soft snick of the lock was barely audible against the ringing in her ears. Outside, the bullets stopped. There were no shouts between the attackers, no alarms, no barking dogs or screaming of wounded. The sudden silence was total, broken only by the deep, shuddering breathing in the warm and muggy darkness. A halogen beam flickered on, revealing the shocked faces of the team as David shone it around their retreat. A mid-sized room, crowded with desks and computer equipment. There were no windows.
"Did you see that? God, they wouldn't go down! Did you see that?"
Nobody answered, and though they were out of immediate danger, Rebecca didn't feel her adrenaline slowing, didn't feel her heart settling back to anything approaching normal. It seemed that Umbrella had found a new application for the T-virus.
And like it or not, we're going to have to deal with the consequences.
They were trapped in Caliban Cove, and in this facility, the creatures had guns. David took a final deep breath and exhaled it heavily, flashing the torch's light towards the door. I'd say we've been spotted. Might as well see what we've gotten into. Rebecca, would you turn on the lights? She flipped the wall switch and the room snapped into blinding brilliance, overhead fluorescence pulsing to life. Blinking against the sudden glare, David surveyed the team, saw that Steve had one hand pressed to his chest. Are you hit?
That stopped it.
He seemed more out of breath than the others, his face paler than it should have been. Rebecca glanced at David with a questioning gaze. He nodded at her.
Doesn't appear that we have anywhere else to go.
Check him out.
Anyone else?
Nobody answered as Rebecca stepped up to Steve, motioning for him to take off the vest. David turned and looked around the room, measuring it against the memory of Trent's map and what little he'd seen from the outside. There were half a dozen cheap metal desks, each with a computer and bits of clutter on top. The cement walls were undecorated and plain. There was another door in the west wall that had to lead deeper into the building.
Karen, secure that.
They could check out the rest of the site once they've decided what to do.
Once you decided, Captain. Perhaps you'd like to send them out for a swim? Can't be any worse than what you've already managed.
David ignored the inner voice, perfectly aware of how badly he'd underestimated the situation. The team didn't need to see him wallow in self-doubt. It wouldn't help anything. The question was, what now?
Let's talk. Doesn't look like we're facing an accident after all. What did the note say? The food was drugged and something about a he killing the others? Is it possible that we're not looking at a T-virus spill?
Rebecca looked up from her examination of Steve's chest, the computer expert sitting on one of the desks in front of her. Steve winced as Rebecca's fingers circled the darkening bruise on his right pectoral. Ow! She smiled guiltily at him, shaking her head. You're okay. Nothing's broken. She turned back to David, the smile fading away. Yeah. If there'd been a release, that guy on the door, Ammon, would have been affected. But the Tri-Squads, if they're the result of experiments with the T-virus, they'd have rotted away by now. It's been over 3 weeks since he wrote that note. We should be looking at piles of mush. Either it's a different virus, or someone's been taking care of them. Enzyme upkeep, maybe some kind of refrigeration. David nodded slowly, following her reasoning.
And if that someone had gone mad and killed everyone, why bother?
That corpse waving at us. And the creature or creatures in the cove. It's like he expected people to come,
but didn't mean for us to get very far.
The line from the note ran through David's mind, the words following the plea to stop him.
God knows what he needs to do.
David slipped his shirt back on, shivering from the damp cloth. So, what do we do now? David didn't answer him, not sure what to say. He felt so drained, so exhausted and uncertain.
Our options are to get out, or go deeper. Considering what's happened so far, I don't feel comfortable making that call. What do you want to do?
David looked warily from face to face, expecting to see anger and disdain. He'd let them down, led them into a perilous situation without a contingency plan, all because he couldn't stand to see the stars tarnished. And now that they were trapped, he didn't know what to do. The expressions they wore, as a group, were thoughtful and intent. He was surprised to see Karen actually smile, and when she spoke, her tone was brightly eager. Since you're asking, I want to figure this out. I want to know what's happening here. Rebecca was nodding. Yeah, me too. And I still want to look at the T-virus.
I want to pick off a few more of those tri-boys. Man, zombies with M16s. Night of the Living Death Squad.
Steve sighed, pushing his wet bangs off his forehead. Might as well keep looking. Going back out isn't exactly safe. It's not the way I would have liked, but getting dirt on Umbrella was the original plan. Yeah, I want to nail these bastards. David smiled, feeling properly embarrassed at himself. He hadn't just underestimated the situation, he'd sorely underestimated his team. What do you want? Really? The question surprised him anew, not because she'd asked, but because suddenly, he didn't have an answer. He thought about the stars, about his obsession with his career and what it had already cost them. All he'd wanted for days was to feel as though his life's work had been meaningful, that it hadn't been wasted, and he'd convinced himself that uncovering the treachery within the job would lay his mind at rest, as if rooting out the corruption would somehow prove that he wasn't worthless.
I've worshipped at the altar of the organization for so long. But isn't this the reason why, the real purpose? Here, in this room, on these faces.
He studied her curious, sharp gaze, felt the rest of them watching him, waiting.
I want for us to survive. I want for us to make it out of here. Amen to that.
David remembered what he told the raccoon team, about each of them doing what they did best if they meant to succeed against Umbrella. He'd said it to get Chris's approval of his operation, but it was a truth that applied to all of them.
Get to it, Captain. John, you and Karen take a look around the building. Check the doors. Be back in 10. Steve, boot up one of those computers. See if you can find a detailed layout of the grounds. Becca, go through the desks. We want maps, data on the tri-squads, T-virus, anything personal about the researchers that might tell us who's behind all this.
David nodded at them, realizing that he felt clearer and more balanced than he had in a long, long time.
Let's do it.
To hell with the stars. They were going to take Umbrella down. Dr. Griffith might not have even noticed the security breach if it hadn't been for the MA7s. It seems that they were useful after all, though not in the way they'd been intended. He'd spent most of the day in the lab, dreamily pondering the pressurized canister standing by the entrance, the shining steel glittering seductively in the soft light. Once he'd made the decision to let the virus go, he'd realized that there was really nothing else he needed to do. The hours had flown by. Each glance at the clock had been a surprise, though not an unpleasant one. He'd be the first, after all, the first convert to the new way of the world. With that in front of him, the only task with which he needed to concern himself was getting the canisters up to the lighthouse. And with the doctors waiting silently, patiently by, even that was taken care of. Just before dawn, he'd give them their final instructions, and then proudly lead the human species into the light, into the miracle of peace. It had been the thought of the MA7s that had finally drawn him out into the caves, the only concern he hadn't already dismissed as trivial. He'd already made a mistake with the Leviathans. Once he'd taken over the facility, he'd lowered the cove gates on impulse, wanting them to be as free as he'd felt. It wasn't until the next day that he'd realized Umbrella might find out and come looking, effectively putting an end to his plans. He'd continued to send in weekly reports and keep up appearances, but there was no good explanation for the escape of the four creatures. It had been sheer luck that the Leviathans had returned on their own. The MA7s were a different matter entirely, of course. They were too violent, too unpredictable to be let out. But letting them starve to death in their cage didn't seem right, particularly not when they, too, would enjoy the effects of his gift. It wasn't their choice to exist as creatures of destruction, even to exist at all. And since he'd played a small role in their creation, he felt a responsibility to do something for them. He'd stood in front of the outer gate for quite some time, considering the problem as all five of the animals hurled themselves repeatedly at the heavy steel mesh, the strange, mournful howls echoing through the damp and winding caves. There was a manual lock near the enclosure, another in the lab, but there was no way to loose them from the lighthouse, and he certainly couldn't let them out before he got to safety. He could send one of the doctors to do it, but the Sevens had a much slower metabolism than the humans, and there was a risk that they would get to him before they made the change. A month before his takeover of the compound, Dr. Chin and two of her vet techs had made the mistake of trying to tend to one of the sick ones. It was a bad way to die, and although he'd be oblivious to the pain once he'd made the transition, he meant to stay with the new world for as long as possible. Griffith had finally decided that euthanasia was the only reasonable choice. It was a reluctant decision, but he could see no alternative. Although the lab was well stocked, poisons weren't his forte, so he decided to look up the information on the mainframe. And there, in the cold comfort of the sealed laboratory, he discovered that his sanctuary had been invaded. He sat in front of the computer in a kind of shock, staring at the blinking cursor that indicated his system was using one of the bunkers. There was no chance that it was a mistake. Except for the lab terminals, the rest of the compound had powered down weeks ago. Umbrella had come. The first emotion to break through his stunned astonishment was rage, a sweeping, red-hot fury that tore away all reason, descending over him like a blinding fire. For a few moments he was lost, his body taken over by the primal force, grasping and rending, tearing at the useless, meaningless things that fell beneath his burning fingers.
They will not stop me, will not.
When his hands touched the cool metal of the canisters, the fire turned to ash. The smooth silver tanks were like a splash of reason, bringing him back to himself. His control returned as abruptly as it had gone, leaving him breathless and sweating.
My creation. My work.
Blinking, gasping, he found himself standing in a sea of ripped papers, broken glass and torn circuitry. He had managed to destroy the computer, the bearer of bad news, in pieces on the cold floor. On another day, he might have been ashamed at the hysterical tantrum, but on this, his eve of greatness, he allowed that the rage had been justified.
Justified perhaps, but pointless. How will you keep them from stopping you? You can't release the string here. You can't risk taking it outside, not now. What are their plans? How much do they know?
He could find out easily enough. There were still two other terminals in the lab, and he walked quickly to one of them, glancing at the mute doctor sitting quietly by the airlock. They'd even noticed his rampage? They gave no sign. He felt a small rush of hatred for them, for creating the useless tri-squads. The unstoppable guards had failed him now that he needed them most. He sat down and turned on the monitor, impatiently waiting for the spinning umbrella of the company logo to disappear. The security network for the compound systems was based in the lab. He'd be able to see what the intruders were seeking without alerting them to his presence, if he could remember how to access the information. He tapped several keys, waited, and typed in his clearance number. After the briefest of pauses, lines of glowing green data spilled across the screen. He'd done it.
Seek, find, locate.
He frowned at the information, wondering why the hell anyone from Umbrella would be searching for the laboratory. And for that matter, why'd they try looking for that information in the mainframe at all? The system designers weren't idiots. There was nothing about the layout in the facility in the files.
And Umbrella would know it. Which means...
Relief coursed through him, cool and pure relief so great that he laughed out loud. He suddenly felt quite silly at his childish reaction to the breach. The searcher wasn't from Umbrella, and that changed everything. Even if they managed to find the lab, an unlucky proposition at best considering its location, they wouldn't be able to gain entry without a keycard. And Griffith had destroyed all of them.
Except for Ammon's. His was never found.
Griffith froze, then shook his head, a nervous smile on his face. No, he'd searched practically everywhere for the missing keycard. What were the chances that the interloper would stumble across it?
And what were the chances that they'd make it past the tri-squads? And what was Lyle up to during those hours when you couldn't find him? What if he did get a message out? You only checked for transmissions to Umbrella, but what if he contacted someone else?
Even as the dreadful, impossible thought occurred to him, the computer began to spit out information on the logic skills test. The socio-psychological series test that Ammon had designed. Griffith felt his control slipping again. He clenched his hands into fists, refusing to give in. There was too much at stake, and he couldn't afford to let his emotions take over. Not now. He had to think.
I'm a scientist, not a soldier. I don't even know how to shoot to fight. I'd be useless in combat. Totally unpredictable. Uncontrollable.
A slow grin spread across his features. Blood was seeping from his fists, from where his ragged fingernails had dug into the heels of his hands, but he felt no pain. His gaze wandered around the open, silent laboratory, resting briefly on the airlock, then to the blank, stupid faces of his doctors, to the cylinders of compressed air and virus, his miracle, and finally, to the controls for the mesh gate that led to the animal enclosure. Dr. Griffith's smile widened. Blood pattered to the floor. Let them come. Chapter 9. As Steve read aloud, Rebecca saw David glance between his watch and the door several times. She didn't think it had been 10 minutes, but it had to be close. John and Karen weren't back yet. Where each is designed to measure application of logic as combined index projective techniques with interval precision, it was rather dry reading, apparently a facility report on the analysis of some kind of IQ test. It had obviously been written by a scientist, was in fact the kind of boring double talk that a lot of researchers tended to fall into when trying to explain anything more complicated than a chair. Still, it was what had come up when Steve had asked for information on Blue Series. Since the room had yielded little else, Rebecca forced herself to pay attention, fighting off the nagging, quiet fear that had settled over her during the fruitless search. Somebody had cleaned out the room, and done a very thorough job of it. She'd found books, staplers, pens and pencils, a ton of rubber bands and paper clips, but not a single piece of paper with writing on it, not a scrap of information to work with. Steve's computer search wasn't much better. No map and nothing at all on the T-virus. Whoever had taken over the facility had apparently wiped out everything they might have been able to use.
Except for a shitload of dull psychobabble, which so far hasn't even mentioned the word blue. How are we supposed to accomplish anything here?
Steve touched a key, then brightened considerably. Here we go. The red series, when looked at on a standardized scale, is the most basic and simple, applicable up to an intelligence quotient of 8. The green series, he broke off, frowning. The screen just went blank. Rebecca looked up from the mostly empty desk she'd been going through as David walked over to join Steve.
System crash?
Steve was still frowning, tapping at keys.
More like a program freeze.
I don't think... Hello, what's this?
Rebecca.
He motioned for her to come look. She closed a drawer full of blank, unreadable file folders and moved over to stand behind Steve, bending down to read what was on the monitor. The man who makes it doesn't need it. The man who buys it doesn't want it. The man who uses it doesn't know it.
It's a riddle. Either of you know the answer?
Before either of them could respond, Karen and John walked back into the room, both of them holstering their weapons. Karen held a sheet of torn paper up in one hand.
Locked up tight. Half a dozen offices, no windows at all, and only one other external door north end.
Karen nodded. There were file cabinets in most of the rooms, but they were empty. Except I found this in one of the drawers, stuck in a crack. It must have ripped off when the place was being cleaned out. She handed the piece of paper to David. He scanned a few lines, his dark gaze taking on a sudden intensity. He turned back to Karen.
This is all there was?
Karen nodded. Yeah. But it's enough, don't you think? David held up the torn sheet and started to read it out loud.
The teams continue to work independently, but have shown a marked improvement since the modification of oral synapses. In Scenario 2, where more than one tri-squad is present, the second team, B, will no longer engage when the first, A, concludes, when target ceases to move or make a sound. If the target continues to provide stimuli and A has discontinued the attack, lack of ammunition/disabling injury to all units, B will engage. If within range, additional patrols will be drawn to the attack and will engage in succession. At this time, we have not successfully managed to expand sensory ability to trigger desired behavior. The visual stimuli of scenarios 4 and 7 continue to be unproductive, although we will be inspecting a new group of units tomorrow and expect correlating results by the end of the week. It is our recommendation that we continue to further develop oral capabilities before considering heat detection implementation. That's where it's torn off.
Karen nodded. It explains a lot, though. Why the team at the back door of the boathouse didn't do anything. The team out front was still firing. It wasn't until you and Steve took them out that the second group moved in. Rebecca frowned, not liking the implications of the report for more than just the obvious. Umbrella's continued experimentation on humans. From what she'd seen in Raccoon, the T-virus took 7 or 8 days to fully amplify in a host. The host then falling to pieces within a month.
So what's this about infecting a new group and getting data in a week? Or for that matter, implementation and sensory modification with the hosts they already have? There shouldn't be time for all that. The unit should be disintegrating way beyond learning new behavior.
She bit her lip nervously, suddenly wondering what the researchers at Caliban Cove might have done with the virus. They'd found a new way to speed up the infective, perhaps tamper with the variant's fusion membrane, made it more cohesive.
Or somehow multiply the inclusionary, allowing it to replicate exponentially. We could be looking at a strain that works in hours, not days.
It was a nasty thought, and one that she didn't want to consider until she had more information to go on. Besides, it wouldn't make a difference in their current situation. The tri-squads were just as deadly either way.
The sign on the north door reads we're in Block C, whatever that means.
He moved to the computer.
Did you find a map?
No, but take a look. I asked for information on the Blue Series, and it started to give us a report on these IQ tests, coded by color. Then, this. I can't get anything else. John peered at the screen, mumbling.
Man who makes it doesn't need it, buys it, doesn't want it, uses it, doesn't know it.
Karen, who had been rereading the Tri-Squad material, looked up with a sudden sharp interest. Wait, I know that one. It's a casket. Somehow, Rebecca wasn't surprised that Karen knew the riddle. The woman struck her as someone who thrived on puzzles. They all gathered around as Steve quickly typed in casket. The screen remained unchanged. Try coffin? Steve's fingers flew across the keys. As soon as he hit enter, the riddle disappeared, replaced by Blue Series activated. Then followed Tests 4 Block A, 7 Block D, and 9 Block B. Blue to access data, Block E. Blue to Ammon's message. That's it. The message received related to the Blue Series, and then said enter answer for key. The answer was coffin,
and the test numbers are the key. There are 3 more lines in the message, then blue to access. The lines must be the answers to the tests. The letters and numbers reverse, time rainbow, and don't count. Joe was right. It's about something we're supposed to find.
Rebecca felt a rush of excitement as David grabbed a pen off the desk and turned over the scrap of Tri-Squad report. The information they had finally made sense. Dr. Ammon's message actually meant something.
We can do this. We've got something solid now.
David drew 5 boxes and 2 lines, the same as on Trent's map. marking the southernmost box with the letter C. After a pause, he tentatively labeled the others, starting top left with A and going right to left, marking the test numbers next to each other.
Assuming that this is right side up, and that we need to complete the tests in order, we'll be moving in a stagger, a zigzag between the buildings. And assuming the Tri-Squads don't have a problem with that.
Rebecca felt her excitement dwindle, could see the same mixed emotions in the suddenly somber expressions they all wore, staring down at the boxes. She'd known that they were going to have to leave eventually, but had somehow managed to avoid thinking about it, putting it off until it was in front of them. It was in front of them now, and the Tri-Squads would be waiting. They stood at the north door in a dark and stuffy hallway, tightening bootlaces, adjusting belts, putting fresh clips into their Berettas. When David was ready, he turned to John and nodded.
Give it back to me.
You, Steve, and Rebecca will take the one on the left, northwest from here. Once we hear you get clear, Karen and I go straight across. If your guess is right, we'll be in Block D. If you're upside down, Block B. Either way, we secure the building, find the test number, and wait for you to show up and give us the go-ahead.
And if I don't?
Karen took up the recital. If we don't hear from you in half an hour, we come back here and wait for Steve and Rebecca. We complete the test if it's feasible. John grinned, a white flash in the gloom.
And then get our asses over the fence.
Right. Good.
They were ready. There were infinite variables in the equation, any number of things that could go wrong with the simple plan. That was always the case. There was no way to prepare for everything that could happen, not at this point, and the decision to split up was their best chance to avoid detection by the Tri-Squads.
Any questions before we go?
Rebecca spoke up, her youthful voice tight with concern. I'd like to remind everybody again to be extremely careful about what you touch or what touches you. The Tri-Squads are carriers, so try to avoid getting close to them, particularly if they're wounded. David shuddered internally, remembering what she told them before, that one drop of infected blood could hold millions, hundreds of millions of virus particles. Not a pleasant thought, considering a 9mm round could inflict a lot of damage.
And they don't lie down with the hit. Three by the boathouse just kept coming, walking and firing and bleeding.
They were waiting for his signal. David shook the thoughts off and thumbed the safety on his weapon, putting his other hand on the door latch.
Ready? Quietly now. On 3. 1, 2, 3.
He pushed the door open and slipped outside to the cool night air and the whisper of ocean waves. It was much brighter than before, the almost full moon having risen high, bathing the compound in silvery blue light. Nothing moved. Straight in front of him, about 20 meters away, was John and Karen's destination, and he was relieved to see a door set into the concrete wall facing Block C. They wouldn't have to go around to get inside. David edged away from the door to his left, hugging the narrow shadow of the wall. He could just make out the front of the building he hoped was A, tall, wind-bent pines to the left and behind it. There was a darker shadow midway along its length, a door, and no cover in the 30-plus meters that spanned the distance. Once they stepped away from C, they'd be totally vulnerable.
There's a team between the two lines of building.
He shot a glance back, saw Rebecca and Steve tensed and waiting behind him. They were going to walk into a corridor of fire. At least he'd be in front. Steve and Rebecca should have time to get back to cover. He took a deep breath, held it, and broke away from the wall, running in a low crouch for the dark square of the block's entry. Shapes of pallid light and shadow blurred past. His entire being was waiting for the flash of an automatic, the crack of the fire, the sharp and piercing pain that would take him down. But it was silent and still, the only sound the violent stammer of his heart, the rush of blood through his veins. Seconds stretched, an eternity as the door loomed closer, larger. Then the latch was under his fingers, and he was pushing, bursting into a stifling blackness, spinning around to see Rebecca and then Steve come lunging in after him. David closed the door quickly but quietly, sensing the emptiness of the dark room, the lack of life. And then the smell hit him. Either Steve or Rebecca gagged, a dry bark of involuntary revulsion as David snatched for the torch, already dreading what he knew he would see. It was the same terrible stink that they'd come across in the boathouse, but 100 times more powerful. Even without the recent reference, David knew the odor. He'd experienced it in a jungle of South America, and in a cultist camp in Idaho, and once in the basement of a serial killer's house. The smell of rotting, multiple death was unforgettable, a rancid bile like sour milk and fly-blown meat.
How many? How many will that be?
The beam snapped on, and as it found the tottering, reeking pile that took up one corner of the large storage room, David saw that there was no way to be certain. The bodies had started to melt into one another, the blackened, shriveling flesh of the stacked corpses blending and pulling from the humid heat. Maybe 15. Maybe 20. Retching, Steve stumbled away and threw up, a harsh and helpless sound in the otherwise quiet room. David quickly took in the rest of the chamber. Finding a door against the back wall, the letter A blocked across it in black. Without another look at the terrible mound, he hustled Rebecca towards the far door, grabbing Steve as they passed. Once they were through, the smell faded to barely tolerable. They were in a windowless corridor, and though there was a light switch next to the door, David ignored it for the moment, catching his breath, letting the two young team members collect themselves. Apparently, they'd found the umbrella workers of Caliban Cove. Oh, but at least one of them, anyway. And David decided that if they ran across him, he'd shoot first and not bother with any questions at all. Karen and John stood at the door for a full minute after the others had gone, cracked open just wide enough for them to listen. Cool air filtered through the opening, faraway hiss of waves, but no shots, no screams. Karen let the door close and looked at John, pale features masked in the dim light. Her voice was low, even, and terribly serious. They're in by now. You want to take lead, or would you prefer if I went first? John couldn't help himself.
My women always go first. Though I prefer when we go together, if you know what I mean.
Karen sighed heavily, a sound of pure exasperation. John grinned, thinking about how easy she was. He knew he shouldn't devil her, but it was hard to resist. Karen Driver kicked ass with a weapon, and she was sharp as a tack in the brains department. But she was also one of the most humorless people he'd ever known.
It's my duty to help her lighten up. We're gonna die. Might as well be laughing as crying.
A simple philosophy, but one he held dear. It had gotten him through many an unpleasant situation in the past. John, just answer the goddamn question.
I'll go. Wait till I get through, then follow.
She nodded briskly, stepping back to let him by. He briefly considered telling her that he'd greet her at the door wearing nothing but a smile, but decided against it. They'd worked together for almost 5 years, and he knew from experience that he could only go so far before she got pissy. Besides, it was a good line, and he didn't want to waste it. As soon as his hand closed over the latch, he took a deep breath, letting his sparkling wit take a back seat to what he thought of as his soldier mind. There was humor, and then there was conquering the enemy, and while he enjoyed both immensely, he learned long ago to keep them separate.
Gonna be a ghost now. Gonna slide through the dark like a shadow.
He gently pushed the door open. No sound, no movement. Holding his Beretta loosely, he stepped away from the building and moved quickly through the silvery dark, fixing on the door that was scarcely 20 steps away. His soldier mind fed him the facts. Cool wind, the soft tread of boots against dirt, the smell and taste of the ocean. But his heart told him that he was a ghost, floating like an invisible shadow through the night. He reached the door, touching the clammy metal bar with steady fingers, and it wouldn't move. The entrance was locked. No panic, no worry. He was a shade that no one else could see. He'd find another way in. John held up a hand, telling Karen to wait, and edged smoothly to his right.
Silent and easy. Shadow without form.
He reached the corner and slid around, letting his heightened senses continue to feed him information. No movement in the whispering night, the rough feel of concrete against his left shoulder and hip, the steady pump of exhilaration and fluidity in his muscles. There was another door facing the broad, glimmering openness of the sea. Cool light matte against metal. Bullets hit the dirt at his feet. John spun and leaped backward, flattening himself against the wall as he grabbed for the latch. Walking from the direction of the boathouse, a line of 3, and John tore the door open and jumped behind it. Heard the clatter of 22 rounds smash into the metal, stopped inches from his body by the explosive ping 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 that rattled the door. He held the door open with his foot, took a split second to look around the edge and targeted the flash of light, squeezing the trigger as chips of concrete and dust flew from the wall. The 9mm jumped, a part of his hand, and he was an animal now, at one with the thundering rounds, the pull of his breath, the awareness of himself as both a man and a bringer of death. Another look and the line was closer now, the 3 dark figures taking shape. John got off another shot, ducked behind the door, and when he looked again, there were only 2 standing behind him. John whirled and saw them, 2 of them, 10 feet away at the northeast corner of the building. Both held automatic rifles.
But made no move to fire.
He felt panic then, a screaming, whining beast in his gut that threatened to devour him from the inside out.
Holy shit!
The fusillade of the M16 was still approaching, but he could only see the creatures that stood there, watching him with blank and rubbery eyes, wobbling on unsteady legs. The one on the left had only half a face. From the nose down was a liquid, pulpy mass of tissue, chunks of dark wetness hanging from strings of elastic flesh. The one on the right looked intact at first, if deathly white and dirty, until he saw the exploded mass of its belly. The limp, dripping snake of intestines flopped out against its bloody shirt.
Won't engage until A finishes.
John stepped backward into the warm dark of the building, using one distant arm to hold the door open against the terrors that still fired. He leaned out and aimed as carefully as he could manage, squashing the panic as best he could. Neither of the creatures moved to defend themselves, only stood there, teetering on rotting legs, watching him. 2 clean headshots, explosively loud over the continuing rattle of the M16s. Before they'd even hit the ground, John heard another 9mm thundering through the darkness, drowning out the automatic fire.
Karen!
He shot another glance around the door, and saw the crumpling figures of the engaged team 100 feet away, one of them still firing as it fell, its rattling rifle aimed uselessly at the sky. Karen crouched out from between the buildings, handgun still pointing at the spasming shooter, her back to John.
Teams won't engage.
Don't shoot him! Over here, leave him!
She turned, a lithe and graceful spin, sprinted to meet him. As soon as she was through, he pulled the door closed, the crack of the automatic muted to a dull popping sound. John sagged back against the door as Karen fumbled for the lock, his brain still screaming at him that he'd seen the impossible, that he'd just killed 2 dead men. There was nowhere he could put that information that wouldn't drive him insane.
Can't be. Didn't believe it. Didn't believe it before. Didn't know. And they were dead. They were rotting. And they were...
Karen's ragged whisper broke the warm dark, broke through the cycling chain of his spinning, dizzying thoughts. Hey, John. Was it good for you? He blinked, the words registering slowly. Going first, I mean. Was it everything you hoped it would be? He felt a creeping amazement take the place of the whirling, terrible thoughts, the confusion ebbing, the waters of his mind becoming clear again.
That's not funny.
Chapter 10. The farther away they got from the front of the concrete block, the less noxious the air, for which Rebecca was deeply grateful. She'd been seconds away from vomiting herself. The smell was that bad, a greasy, oily stench that seemed almost tangible, an entity in itself. As they moved quietly through the well-lit hall, she found herself thinking again about Nicholas Griffith, about the story of the Marburg victims. And although there was no proof that he was behind the mass slaughter of the Umbrella people, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was responsible. The corridor led them past several open rooms, each as barren and sterile as the building they'd come from. They passed an exit at the far side of the block, and after another turn in the hall, finally came to a door marked with the letter A, and below it, 1 through 4. There were 3 triangles beneath the numbers, each a different color: red, green, and blue. David opened the door, revealing a much shorter hall, stark fluorescent lights spilling into the stale darkness. There were 2 doors, one on either side. Steve found the lights and turned them on, and Rebecca saw that there were more of the colored triangles on the door to their right. The other was blank.
I'll take the test. Steve, you and Rebecca check out the other room. We'll meet back here.
Rebecca nodded, saw Steve do the same. He looked a little pale, but seemed steady enough, though he dropped his gaze when he noticed her looking. She felt a pang of sympathy for him, realizing that he was probably embarrassed for losing his lunch. They opened the unlabeled door and stepped into yet another windowless room as stuffy and warm as the rest of the building. Rebecca turned on the lights, and a rather large office lined with bookshelves flickered into view. The steel desk sat in one corner next to a filing cabinet, the empty drawer standing open.
Looks like another bust. You want the desk or the shelves?
Rebecca shrugged.
Shelves, I guess.
He grinned shyly.
Just as well. Maybe I can find some breath mints or something in one of the drawers.
Rebecca smiled, glad that he'd made the joke.
Save me one. I saw a little bit down back there, and it was a close call.
They locked gazes, still smiling, and Rebecca felt a tiny shiver of excitement run through her as the seconds stretched, lingering a few beats longer than a more casual exchange. Steve looked away first, but his color had returned, his cheeks slightly pinker than before. He moved to the desk, and Rebecca turned to face a row of books, feeling a little flushed herself. There was a definite attraction there, and it seemed to be mutual.
And it's only about the worst time and place to consider it. Secure that shit, pronto!
The books were about what she might have expected, considering what they knew about the Tri-Squads and Umbrella. Chemistry, biology, a whole set of leather-bound texts on behavior modification, several medical journals. As Steve rummaged through the desk behind her, she ran her hand along the row, pushing the books towards the back of the shelf as she glanced over the titles. Maybe there was something hidden behind one of them.
Sociology, Pavlov, psych, pathology.
She stopped, frowning at a slender black volume tucked between 2 larger books. No title. She pulled it out and felt her heart speed up as she opened the small book, seeing the spidery handwriting on the lined pages. She flipped to the front, saw Tom Athens written in neat letters on the inside cover.
One of the guys on the list! One of the researchers! Hey! I found a diary! It belongs to one of the people from Trent's list, Tom Athens!
Steve looked up from the desk, his dark eyes flashing. No shit? Go to the back. What's the last date? Rebecca ruffled through the pages to the end, scanning as she went.
Says July 18th. But it doesn't look like he kept it regular. The one before that is July 9th.
Just read the last entry. Maybe it will tell us what's going on. She walked to the desk and leaned against it, clearing her throat.
July 18th, Saturday. It's been a long and ridiculous day, the end of a long and ridiculous week. I swear to God, I'm going to beat the crap out of Lewis if he calls one more stupid meeting. Today was whether or not we should add a new scenario into the Tri-Squad program, as if we need another one. All he really wanted was to get it on paper, and the rest of it was his usual bullshit. The importance of teamwork, the need to share information so we can all stay on the right track. I mean, Jesus, it's like he can't live with the concept that a weekly might go out without his name on it. And he hasn't done dick since the MA7 disaster, except to try and convince everyone that it was Chin's fault. So much for not speaking ill of the dead, sanctimonious prick. Alan and I talked over the implants yesterday. That's going well. He's going to write up the proposal this week, and we're not going to let Lewis touch it. With any luck, we'll get a green light by the end of the month. Alan figures the white boys are going to want to run it past Birkin, though God only knows why. He doesn't give a shit what we're doing out here. He's off being brilliant again. I have to admit, I'm looking forward to his next synthesis. Maybe we can work out some of the bugs in the Tri-Squad.
There was a minor scare in D on Wednesday in 101. Someone left the refrigerator open, and Kim swears that there are some chemicals missing, so I'm starting to think she miscounted again. Hard to believe she's in charge of the infection process. The woman's a ditz, and she's sloppy as hell when it comes to maintaining the equipment. I'm surprised she hasn't managed to infect the entire compound. God knows there's enough in there to do it. I should probably get over to D myself, make sure everything's ready for tomorrow. Got a new batch shipping in, and Griffith actually asked to watch the process. First time he's come out of the lab in weeks. First time he's ever taken an interest in what the rest of us are doing. I know it's stupid, but I still want him to be impressed. He's as brilliant as Birkin, in his own creepy way. I think he even intimidates Lewis, and Lewis is generally too stupid to scare. More later. The rest of the pages were blank. Rebecca looked up at Steve, not sure what to say, her mind working to glean the relevant bits of information from the rambling tirade. There was something in there that bothered her, something that she couldn't quite place. Missing chemicals, infection process, the brilliant, creepy Dr. Griffith. She no longer had any doubt that Griffith had killed the others, but that wasn't what sent her internal alarms jangling. It was Block D. A look of anxious fear played across his face. If we're in A, Karen and John are in D.
Where there's enough of the T-virus to infect the entire compound, where the infection process took place. We should tell David.
Steve nodded, both of them moving quickly for the door, Rebecca hoping desperately that John and Karen wouldn't find room 101, and that if they did, they wouldn't touch anything that could hurt them. The test room was big, 3 of the walls lined with open-ended cubicles. Once he turned on the lights, he saw that the tests were clearly numbered and colored, the symbols painted on the cement floor in front of each one. All of the red series was on his left, closest to the door. He saw brightly colored blocks and simple shapes on the tables in each cubicle as he walked past, heading for the back of the room. The green series lined the wall opposite, though he ignored it entirely. The back wall was marked with blue triangles, the number 4 test in the far right corner. As he neared the back of the room, he heard a faint hum of power coming from the blue test area. There was a small computer on the table in number 2, a keyboard and headset in 3. As promised, the series was activated, though what they were connected to, he couldn't imagine.
Can't imagine and don't care. Once we solve these little puzzles, we'll find out whatever's been hidden from us and get out, away from this cemetery. Can't happen soon enough.
David had seen all he wanted to see of Caliban Cove. Corpses in the front hall had been bad, but it was the thoughts that they'd inspired that troubled him, made him so suddenly eager to get his team out. The Tri-Squads were dangerous and deadly. The monster in the cove's waters had been horrible. But somewhere in the facility lurked a monster of a different kind entirely. One that had murdered his own people and then stacked them like kindling in a dark place. That kind of insanity chilled him far worse than the immoral greed of Umbrella, and he was afraid of what such a man might do to the handful of soldiers trying to stop him.
We'll find the material, probably notes on Umbrella, perhaps on the virus itself. And then break for the fence, get well away from this madness. Let the feds handle the rest. They're smart. They'll blow up the entire compound and gather the information from the ashes.
He stopped in front of the last cubicle, returning his attention to the task at hand. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to see, but the setup of test number 4 surprised him nonetheless. A table and chair, utilitarian gray metal. On the table was a pad of paper, a pencil, and an expensive chess set, all of the pieces in place. As he stepped into the cubicle, he saw that there was a metal plaque set into the surface of the table, a string of numbers etched into the steel. David sat in the chair, peering down at the numbers. 9, 22, 3. 14, 26, 9, 16, 8. 7, 19, 22. 8, 11, 12, 7. He frowned, looking up at the chess set, and then back at the numbers. There was nothing else to look at, that was it. He quickly sorted through the clues of Ammon's message. wondering which was supposed to be the answer. Was it the letters and numbers reversed, or don't count? Since there didn't seem to be anything relating to time or a rainbow, it had to be one of the two.
The lines are in the same order as the tests. This is the letter and number reversal. What letters? There aren't any.
David smiled suddenly, shaking his head. The numbers on the plaque didn't go any higher than 26. It was a code, and a fairly simple one. He picked up the paper and quickly jotted down the letters of the alphabet, then numbered them backwards. A was 26, B 25, all the way back to Z 1. Glancing back and forth between the plaque and the paper, he wrote down the numbers and then started to decipher the message.
R, E, X, M.
The final letter was a T, and he stared down at the sentence, then at the chessboard. It seemed that somebody had a sense of humor. Rex marks the spot. Rex was Latin for king.
White always goes first. So...
He reached out and touched the white king. As soon as his finger contacted the piece, it swiveled in place, turning around to face the back of the board. At the same time, there was a soft, musical tone from overhead. He looked up and saw a tiny speaker set into the ceiling. Nothing else happened. No flashing lights or secret passageways opening up behind the wall. Apparently, he'd passed.
How anticlimactic.
It seemed like an awfully complicated test for something as supposedly mindless as a tri-squad zombie. Though perhaps the researchers had been making plans for something else, something intelligent. It was an unsettling thought, and not one he wanted to ponder. He stood up and turned towards the front of the room. Just as the door burst open, Rebecca and Steve hurrying in, wearing matching expressions of fear.
What is it?
Rebecca held up a book, talking fast. We found a journal. It says that the strain of the virus used to infect the Tri-Squads is in Block D in room 101. Maybe everything's fine, but if John and Karen touch anything that's been contaminated... He'd heard enough.
Let's go.
They turned and he strode past them, leading them back the way they'd come, his thoughts racing. They had passed an exit on the far side of the building. He could send Steve and Rebecca to the next block over while he went to D just as originally planned, only much faster, now carrying the horrible, heavy fear that two of his people might accidentally uncover the T-virus.
It won't happen. They'll be careful. The chances of one of them getting a cut and then touching something dangerous in a room that's bound to be marked as some kind of a laboratory.
The reassuring facts did nothing to ease his mind. They hurried towards the exit, a deepening knot of dread settling into the pit of David's stomach. They stood in the bright corridor at the center of D Block, silently listening for a sound that would tell them David had come. From their position, they should be able to hear any one of the three external doors being used. After securing the building and finding the test room, she and John had chalked open all of the passages that led to the block's exits. Karen checked her watch and then rubbed her eyes, feeling a bit worn out from all of the night's events and still sick about what they'd found in room 101. Even John seemed unusually subdued and definitely quieter than normal. He hadn't cracked a single joke since they'd walked back to begin their wait.
Maybe he's thinking about the gurneys fixed with bloody restraints, or the syringes, or the surgical equipment heaped in the sink.
They'd found the test room first, a large chamber filled with little tables, each marked with numbers between 5 and 8. Karen had been somewhat disappointed to see that the blue series number 7 was just a handful of colored tiles with letters on them, half of them upside down and unreadable. All the colors corresponded to rainbows, but there were 2 extra violet tiles in the heaped pile. Since they couldn't risk messing with it until David had completed the first test, she'd reluctantly turned away, suggesting they check out the rest of the block. They'd gone through a couple of offices, empty, and a cluttered coffee room, where they'd found a box of incredibly moldy donuts and little else. It had been the chemical lab that had told them the most about the kind of place Umbrella had created, and although Karen didn't believe in ghosts, the room had given her a feeling like nothing she'd ever experienced before. It was haunted, plain and simple, haunted by the misery of fear and the cold, Nazi-esque precision of scientists committing atrocities against their fellow man.
You thinking about that room?
Karen nodded, but didn't say anything. John seemed to sense her unspoken desire not to talk about it, for which she was thankful. The weight of her good luck charm was the only other comfort she felt at the moment, and she longed to take it out, to feel reassured by memories of her father and successful missions gone by. Anything to take her mind off the lab room. The outer door to 101 was clearly marked with a biohazard symbol, and they briefly discussed not going in at all, John arguing against entering a possibly contaminated environment. Karen had pointed out that neither of them had any cuts or abrasions, and that they might find something about the T-virus to take with them. The truth was, she couldn't stand to let such an opportunity pass. She wanted to see what was behind the closed door because it was there. Because leaving it unopened would get under her skin. John had finally agreed, and they'd gone in, stepping into a small entryway that was draped with sheets of heavy plastic. There were shower nozzles overhead and a drain set into the floor, a decon area. A smaller second door had opened up into the room itself, leading them into a mad scientist's dream. Glass crunching underfoot, a tired smell of anxious sweat beneath the acrid odor of bleach. John found the lights, and even before the large room snapped into view, Karen felt her heart start to pound. There was a dark tension that filled the air, a sense of foreboding that radiated from the very walls. It looked like a dozen other lab facilities she'd worked in, counters and shelves, a couple of metal sinks, a large stainless steel refrigeration unit in one corner with a lock on the handle. And somehow, that was the worst. That the environment was so familiar, a place she'd always felt at home. The few differences were dramatic ones. The room was dominated by a stainless autopsy table, fitted with Velcro restraints, and there were 2 additional hospital gurneys next to it, likewise fitted. As she walked over to look at one of them, she saw the dark, dried stains at either end. The thin pad was soaked with blood from where a man's ankles and wrists would be. In the back of the room was a cage the size of a large walk-in closet, heavy bars surrounding an unpadded bench. Next to the cage, several slender poles leaned against the wall, each a meter or so in length, and tipped with hypodermic needles. They were the kinds of instruments used to drug wild animals, allowing the person operating them not to get within reach. Karen looked down at the gurney, lightly touching the long dried stain, wondering what kind of person could have willingly participated in such an experiment. The crust of blood was old, powdery, and filled her with thoughts of what the victims must have endured, waiting in the cage, perhaps watching as some gloved madman injected a toxic, mutating virus into a helpless human being. It was a bad place, a place of evil deeds. They'd both felt it, both been affected by the realization of what had gone on there. Karen's right eye itched, distracting her from the terrible remembrance, drawing her back to the present. She rubbed at it, then looked at her watch again. It had only been 20 minutes since the team had split, though it felt longer. There was the sound of a door opening, followed by David's excited shout through the corridor. He'd come in through the west entrance.
Karen! John!
John grinned at her. She felt a wave of relief. David was okay.
Here, keep walking. Take a right at the T.
His footsteps pounded through the hall. In a few seconds, he appeared at the corner and jogged towards them, his face tight with concern. Is everything...
Did you find the laboratory room? Room 101?
John frowned, his smile fading.
Yeah, it's back the way you came. Did either of you touch anything? Do you have any cuts? Any small wounds that might have come in contact with anything?
Their confusion must have shown. David spoke quickly, looking back and forth between them.
We found a journal, naming it as the room where they were infected the Tri-Squads.
John smiled again.
Well, no shit. We figured that much out in about 2 seconds.
Karen held out her hands, turning them over for David to see. Not a scratch.
Oh, thank God. I had the worst feeling all the way over that something had happened. We found the researchers in Block A. Amin was right. He killed them. And he has a name now. Rebecca seems certain that it's Nicholas Griffith. He was the one she recognized from Trent's list, and he has a rather sordid history. She can fill you in when we regroup.
He shook his head, a smile wavering on his lips.
I suppose I let my imagination run wild for a moment.
John smiled wider.
Jeez, David, I had no idea you cared. Or that you thought we'd be stupid enough to stick ourselves with dirty needles in a place like this.
Please accept my sincerest apologies.
Where are Steve and Rebecca?
Probably in the next test area by now. I saw them safely off to Block B before I came here. Did you find Test 7?
This way.
As they started down the hall, he began to recount their run-in with the Tri-Squads. Karen followed, rubbing at the maddening, elusive itch in her right eye. She must have irritated it with all of the rubbing. It seemed to be getting worse. And to top things off, she felt a headache coming on. She wiped at her eyes, sighing inwardly at the timing. She never got headaches unless she was coming down with something. The swim in the ocean must have set her up nicely for a cold. And from the building throb in her head, it was going to be a nasty one. Chapter 11. After he'd instructed Athens and sent him on his way, he prepared the syringes and decided on a place to hide. There was nothing left for him to do but wait. In spite of his earlier feelings of confidence, he was nervous now, pacing through the lab relentlessly. What if Athens had forgotten how to load a rifle? What if the enclosure release didn't work, or the intruders had the firepower to stop the MA7s? He'd tried to prepare for every possibility, each plan unfolding into a backup. But what if everything failed, if all of them fell through?
I'll kill them myself. I'll strangle them with my bare hands. They will not stop me from doing what must be done. They can't. Not after all I've accomplished. Not after everything I've been through to get where I am.
For the second time that day, flashback to the takeover of the compound. The strange, vivid images of that bright and sunny day less than a month ago. Instead of blocking the thoughts as he'd done before, he let them come, inviting them in, to remind him of what he was capable of doing when the need arose. He abruptly stopped pacing, moved to a chair, collapsing into it and closing his eyes.
A bright and sunny day.
Once he'd realized what had to be done, he'd planned it for over 2 weeks, working over each detail tirelessly until he'd been satisfied that every variable had been addressed. He'd spent time reading about the Tri-Squads and going through the master logs, memorizing the routine of the facility. He'd watched the habits of his colleagues, learned their schedules until he could recite them backwards. He'd stared for hours at the sketches he'd made of each building, walking through them in his mind 1,000 times. After careful consideration, he chose a date, and several days before, he'd slipped into the Tri-Squad processing room and stolen several small vials of extremely powerful medication.
Colocitazine, Methadone, Troponide, animal tranquilizers, and a synthesized narcotic. Some of Umbrella's finest work.
It had only taken him an afternoon to get the mix the way he'd wanted it, just as he'd hoped. Then he'd waited, much as he was waiting now. The day before his plan was to unfold, he'd watched the Tri-Squad processing and then asked Tom Athens to come to the lab after dinner to privately discuss some thoughts he'd had on intensifying the suggestibility factor. Athens had been only too happy to accept, and listened eagerly to Griffith's description of the string he'd already created. Couched in hypothetical terms, of course, and after a nice hot cup of laced coffee, Athens had become the first to experience Griffith's miracle. Griffith smiled, remembering those initial glorious moments, the very first and truly the most important test of the string's effectiveness. He told Athens that the only voice he could hear was that of Nicholas Griffith, that all others would be meaningless babble, and the suggestion had taken as easy as that. In the early hours of that fateful morning, he played a tape of one of Athens' own lectures for the compliant doctor, and the doctor had heard nothing but gibberish. If it had failed, Griffith would have aborted the takeover, no one the wiser. He'd had an unfortunate accident in mind if the strain hadn't worked the way it was supposed to. Athens' body would have been found the next day, washed up on the rocky beach. But the incredible success of his creation and proved beyond doubt that it was meant to be, that he really had no choice but to continue.
And so the kitchen. The drops of sedative in the coffee cups, on the pastry, injected oh so carefully into the fruit, dissolved into the milk, the juices.
Of the 19 men and women who lived and worked in Caliban Cove, only one regularly skipped breakfast and didn't drink coffee, Kim DeSanto, the ridiculous young woman who worked with the T-virus. Griffith had sent Athens to slit her throat as she lay sleeping before the sun came up.
And it was a bright and sunny day, cloudless and clear as they gobbled their breakfasts and swallowed their coffee, walking out into the cool morning air, collapsing to the ground, many of them not making it out of the cafeteria before they stumbled or fell, a few crying out that they'd been poisoned as the words failed them and the drugs sent them to sleep.
Griffith frowned, trying to remember what had happened next. He'd selected Thurman, unable to resist the petty pleasure of showing the good doctor what he'd created. Then Alan Kinnison, although he hadn't given the gift to Alan until later, keeping him sedated. He knew the facts. Thurman and Athens had disposed of the workers and piled them in Block A. Lyle Ammon had managed to keep himself hidden for a time, but had been found by the Tri-Squads later that evening. Griffith had eaten a late supper and gone to bed, waking up early to move papers and software to the lab. These were facts, things he knew, but for some reason, reality had blurred and he couldn't actually remember what he had seen, what had transpired for him the rest of that day. Griffith searched through his thoughts, concentrating, but could only find the same hazy and uncertain images. A blinding midday sun, bathing the sleeping bodies in red. The scream of a gull over the cove, relentless and wild, calling to the hot wind. The coppery smell of dirt and
blood on my hand, on the scalp that glittered wet and sharp, and plunged into the soft, yielding flesh of faces and bellies and eyes, and later the thundering crash of waves in the dark, and the spool of fish line and Ammon, waving.
His eyes snapped open and the nightmare was over. Shaken, Griffith looked around at the cool, soft light of the laboratory. He must have dozed off for a moment. Must have. Yes, that was it. He'd fallen asleep and had had a terrible dream. He looked at the clock, saw that only a few moments had passed since he'd sent the two doctors out. He felt a rush of relief, realizing that he hadn't been asleep for very long, but as the relief ebbed, he felt the nervousness slip back into his body, jittering and pulsing anxiety about the intruders that had come to his facility.
They won't stop me. It's mine.
Griffith stood up and started to pace recklessly, back and forth, waiting. The time rainbow test, number 7, took only a moment longer to complete than test number 4, what David had started to think of as the chess test. John and Karen had shown him to the small table in the big room, standing behind him as he uprighted the colored tiles and laid them out. Beneath the heap of 9 rainbow-shaded pieces was an elongated indentation, perhaps a foot long and 2 inches across. It was clear that just 7 of the tiles would fit.
7 colors in the rainbow, 7 tiles. Simple. So why are there 9 of them?
David ordered the pieces by their colors, placing them in a row beneath the indentation. Each bore a different letter on top, inked in black. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo. And 3 violet tiles with 3 different letters.
Is it supposed to spell something?
Going from left to right, the first 6 tiles read J, F, M, A, M, J. Not in English. The 3 violet pieces were J, M, and F.
It's one of those where you have to figure out the next in the series. Apparently relating to time. Any thoughts?
John and Karen both stared down at the puzzle, studying the letters. He wondered if they were as tired as he was starting to feel. John seemed distinctly less chipper than usual, and Karen looked fairly wiped out, her skin pale and gaze somewhat distant.
Of course they're tired, but at least they're making an attempt.
David looked back at the colored pieces and tried to focus, but he couldn't seem to manage a single coherent idea. It had been an awfully long day, periods of intense concentration interspersed with violent rushes of adrenaline. He'd run through fear, self-doubt, determination, and then fear again, plus a handful of less clear-cut emotions. Now he just felt frazzled, waiting to see what would come next. John grinned suddenly, triumphant light in his eyes.
The letters stand for the months. January, February, March, April, May, June, July. It's J. The letter is J.
Brilliant.
He started to place the tiles in the indentation as John nudged Karen with his elbow, still grinning.
And you thought all I was good for was easy sex.
As usual, Karen didn't bother answering. Relieved to be through the second test, David pushed the last piece into place. There was a faint click, and the rainbow lowered slightly, perhaps a millimeter. From above them, a gentle chime sounded from a speaker, this one hidden by a fluorescent bar.
That all I get? No parade?
David stood up, smiling tiredly.
I felt the same way with the other one. We should get moving. See how Steve and Rebecca are making out.
Interesting way of putting it, David. Nice one.
It took David a moment to get it, though Karen rolled her eyes almost immediately, then scratched at them. When she took her hand away, David saw that her right eye was extremely bloodshot. The left was also slightly discolored, though not as badly. She noticed his scrutiny and smiled at him, shrugging. I irritated it somehow. It itches, but it's fine.
Don't rub at it, you'll make it worse. And have Rebecca look at it when we get across.
They walked back into a connecting corridor and started for the back exit, David steeling himself for another dash across the compound. By his count, they managed to take down 3 of the tri-squads in full. 3 men outside of the boathouse and a 4th on the run to the first building. And then John and Karen's 5 between Block C and D.
Useful information. You happen to know how many of the squads there were to begin with.
He ignored the inner sarcasm as they reached the metal door, Karen leaning back to turn off the overhead light. They pulled out weapons and took deep breaths, preparing. And David felt a familiar sensation wash over him, one that he'd experienced before in tight situations but had never been able to name. It wasn't a feeling so much as a state of existence, and although not a religious man, it was the closest thing he'd found to a belief in fate, a sense that there were patterns at play beyond the realm of human influence. Whatever was going to happen, whatever was already happening, even as they readied themselves to step back outside, all of the deciding factors were now firmly in place, interlocking like pieces of a puzzle. He felt it with a certainty that denied reason. It was as though a great wheel of chance that determined outcome, that would show them life or death, success or failure, had been set into motion, and was now spinning towards its inevitable conclusion. Only instead of slowing down, the wheel would turn steadily faster, speeding up as it revealed to them what the cosmos had planned. In the past, he'd often found comfort in the sudden awareness of that spinning wheel, the undefinable sense that the outcome had been decided and all anyone could do was watch it unfold. When he'd been a child and his father had been on one of his drunken, abusive rampages, the belief in a bigger picture had sometimes been the only thing that saved him from total despair. This time, it felt like a terrible thing, a dark and whirling carnival ride that they had boarded by mistake, not realizing the truth until it was too late, that they couldn't go back, and there was no avoiding whatever lay ahead.
We hang on, men. We do what we can.
David stepped to the door, flicking the Beretta's safety off. Whether or not they had any control over what was to come, Rebecca and Steve were waiting. The test room was quiet except for the soft hum from the machines marked with blue numbers, 9 through 12, and the occasional rustle of a turning page as Rebecca went through Athens' journal. Steve sat on the edge of the table and watched her read, his thoughts restless and uneasy as they waited for the others to show up. His chest ached mildly, both from the small caliber round he'd taken earlier and from the anxious build of worry for John and Karen. After a quick look at the other rooms in the building, they'd both agreed that the test room was the place to wait. It seemed that Block B of the Umbrella facility was mostly devoted to surgical aspects of the bioweapons research, the rooms all white and steel, anxiously stark and unpleasant. Although the building was as stuffy and warm as the others they'd been in, Stephen felt a physical chill as they passed the empty operating rooms, as if the chambers themselves had taken on the characteristics of the T-virus creatures. Cold and lifeless, and somehow mindlessly black with purpose. Rebecca looked up, her eyes flashing with excitement.
Listen to this. They're still waiting for our feedback on expansion ever since Griffith revved up the amp time. We've got the space for up to 20 units, but I'm going to hold strong on a max of 12. We wouldn't be able to concentrate on training more than 4 squads at a time. Ammon said he'll back me up if there's any hassle.
Steve nodded, half dismayed and half relieved by the information. They'd already knocked one of the tri-squads out of the running, plus seriously wounded or killed a couple of the individuals on the other team. That was good. On the other hand, it meant that there were still a couple of the squads roaming around out there.
Unless they're currently engaged with David and the others.
He scowled inwardly, grasping for something else to think about.
Do you know what that means? Ramped up the amp time?
Rebecca nodded slowly, worry creasing her brow.
I'm pretty sure he means that Griffith sped up the amplification process. Amplification is the term for a virus's spread through a host.
That didn't sound like something he wanted to think about either. By some unspoken agreement, they hadn't talked about the possibility of John or Karen being infected since David had left.
Great.
You find anything else in there?
She shook her head. Not really. He mentions the MA7s a couple of times, but nothing more specific than that they're a T-virus experiment that didn't work. And he's definitely kind of an asshole.
Kind of. Rebecca smiled briefly.
Okay, that's an understatement. He's a money-hungry, immoral bastard.
Steve nodded, thinking about the partial report they'd found on the tri-squads, and for that matter, the very existence of the facility, calling the T-virus victims units, setting up operating rooms and aptitude tests to run them through like rats in a maze.
It's like they can't acknowledge that they're performing their experiments on human beings. On real people. How could they do this? How do they sleep at night?
Rebecca gazed at him solemnly, as if she had an answer but wasn't sure how to say it. Finally, she sighed.
When you specialize in one field, particularly when it's a field that demands linear thinking and a very defined focus on only one tiny element of something, it's kind of hard to explain. But it's frighteningly easy to get lost in that single element, to forget there's a world outside of that element. When you spend your days looking into a microscope, surrounded by numbers and letters and processes, some people get lost. And if they were unstable to begin with, the ambition to pursue that element can take over, meaning everything else is unimportant.
Steve saw what she was getting at, and was impressed anew with how thoughtful she was. How clearly she communicated herself.
All that and a smile that lights up a room. When we get out of this, I'm moving to Raccoon City. Or I'll at least find out if she's seeing anyone.
There was a sound from somewhere in the building. Footsteps. Steve pushed himself off the table and walked quickly to the door. He leaned out into the corridor and heard David's voice calling through the empty block. "In the back!" Then he waited, anxiously watching the corner in the hall for David to walk into view, John and Karen both healthy and smiling beside him. Rebecca moved to stand next to Steve, and he saw the same concern and hope written across her delicate features. Instinctively, he groped for her hand, feeling a tingling jolt as their fingers touched, half expecting her to pull away. But she didn't, leaning against him instead as she held his hand gently, her skin soft and warm on his. John's booming voice preceded him down the corridor, loud and full of bright good humor.
"Get your clothes on, kids! You've got company!"
She dropped his hand quickly, but the look that she flashed him more than made up for it, a sweet and wistful expression that made his heart skip a beat. But there was a maturity there too, a realization of the circumstances they were in, an acknowledgement of priorities.
No more until we're out of here.
He nodded slightly, and they turned to wait for the others.